to see the stone alignments at Carnac, which are of course famous all over the world. One of the problems they encounter is if they come during tourist season, between March and October, the stones at Carnac aren't freely accessible, and the only way to get in amongst those stones is to pay for an official tour from the visitor centre, which is all well and good, but sometimes that's a bit restrictive and people really can't experience the stones in the way that they want. Well, never fear, because any time of year that you come here, there are other alignments close by, and these are the alignments at Dolmen, which are every bit as impressive in terms of scale. Although there aren't as many stones here, the stone alignment is quite short, but you'll find a lot of the stones here are much larger than what you'll find at Carnac. Very few of the stones that you'll find at Carnac are as tall as these. If you come to Carnac most times of year, certainly through the summer, I'll show you what you can expect to find. Them gates is locked. But here at the allée du Carnac, the gates are open and you're welcome to come on in from the beginning of October until the end of March. So it's that time of year, the gates are open and I'm here amongst the stone rows at Carnac. But I'm not actually interested in looking at these just yet. There's something else I'd like to show you. Tucked away at the western end of the allée du Carnac, in the bend of the road, is the Dolmen du Carnac. It's a classic example of a passage grave. It has a fairly small entrance and a long passage which leads to a large round or sub-rectangular chamber at the end, and the passage is slightly skewed from the axis of the chamber. One of the major features of a lot of these passage graves, and indeed the allée couverte, which followed them 2,000 years later, is about restricting the access, which sadly doesn't stop the cars coming by. But the passage, it usually has a low roof which gradually increases in height until you reach the large chamber at the back. As I say, this is something of a forgotten sight, because most people come to look at these. One of the features you'll note here at Carnac is that at the end of at least two of the major alignments, there's a very large boulder or horizontal stone. We call these a recumbent stone, and they bring to mind the recumbent stone circles of Scotland. Another feature to take particular note of is the way that as these stones progress to the east, they become smaller and smaller. Or could I say, if you move to the west, the stones become progressively larger. Now, we tend to think of movement always being from smaller to larger, and perhaps ending with something happening at these recumbent stones, or indeed at some of the cromlechs that are spaced amongst the alignments here at Carnac. At the end of the day, we'll never really know what went on here, but we can make our best guess. But if you do come to Carnac, you'll find much more than stone rows. You can see here some upright stones placed side by side, and these are the remnants of a cromlech, or a stone circle, that stood at the western end of the alignments, and today they enclose a few houses and a farm, much in the same way that the stone circles at Avebury enclose the village there. Now, Brittany is quite rightly famous for its burial monuments and for its stone alignments, but the other thing it can claim fame for is its many stone enclosures, or cromlechs, some of which are circular and some of which are square, as is the case with this one at Cote. Now, this monument isn't totally square, it's slightly off square, it's slightly longer than it is wide, and the stones are fairly regularly spaced, and in either end is a wider gap, so it would seem to imply some sort of movement through the monument. Now, whether that was of people, whether that was of animals, whether these were living people, dead people, we'll probably never know, but there was certainly some sort of movement going on through this site. So there are prehistoric monuments in many locations all across Europe, all around the world. But there's something about this area of the Gulf of Morbihan that must have meant it was particularly special, because the sheer density of monuments in this area and the sheer variety of them just tells us this was no ordinary landscape. Based on current evidence from radiocarbon dating, what you're looking at here is possibly the second oldest stone-built tomb on Earth. Here at the Dolmens de la Cote, we find some of the earliest examples of these tombs that people decided to start building in stone, somewhere in the middle of the 5th millennium BC. So this tomb here dates to around 4600 BC, and its neighbour is about 700 years younger. These types of passage graves vary enormously in scale, some of them being truly monumental if we think of places like Newgrange or Nowth or Douth in Ireland. And they can be found as far north as the Isles of Orkney and way down into the southern provinces of Spain. As the name suggests, these tombs are characterized by an entrance passageway that can be anything between a couple of meters and 10 or 15 meters in length. At the end of these passageways are a single chamber, usually round or sub-rectangular. The neighbouring tomb, so romantically known as La Coste II, shows a variation on this passage grave theme, where we still have the entrance passageway that extends back into the heart of the tomb, but we have multiple chambers coming off either side of that passageway. This type of tomb is referred to as a transepted tomb and may have been the predecessor of several of the Cotswold Severn tombs in England. If we think about places like Wayland Smithy or West Kennet, they've adopted this similar arrangement, and they originate from a similar time, perhaps a little bit after this one was built. Now, the passage graves of Morbihan are fairly prolific, as they are across many parts of Western Europe. And here around the Gulf of Morbihan, they can be quite monumental in scale. But some of them can be found in some quite quirky places. So this one appears to have got in the way of somebody's house building, but the burial chamber has survived. The passage is long gone. Here at the Dolmen du Manicroch we have another example of these transepted tombs. So you can see the central passageway over my left shoulder there, and then towards the rear of the tomb we have some chambers radiating off either side, these transepts that we refer to in the name of the tomb. So here at the end of the corridor we have 1, 2, 3 and 4 chambers. This one's a little bit different in that it doesn't appear to have a chamber at the far end of the passage. There appears to be a blocking stone. So here at the Dolmen du Carnac we have another example of this transepted tomb design that we saw at La Couste too, but here it's on a much more monumental scale. So we can clearly see the central passageway running down the centre of this tomb, with 2 chambers to the right with very large capstones and a chamber at the far end, again with a large capstone. The 2 chambers on the left have lost their capstones, but it's really not difficult to imagine how this would have appeared when it was being built. Not forgetting that most people won't have seen it looking like this, because the whole thing, when finished, would have been covered by a mound of earth or a cairn of stone. So very often what we're looking at with these megalithic monuments, it's like looking at the skeleton of a whale. So we can see the bones, we can see the basic structure, but we don't actually see what the completed animal looked like. And that's the same with many of these tombs. We have to imagine how they would have looked at their best. As I said earlier, at many of the dolmens that you visit, not just in Brittany but all around Europe, what you're looking at is the skeleton, just the remains of what once was. But in a few places, much of what once was still exists. And this is the cairn or tumulus du Cercado. Cercado is another of these passage graves with a very restricted entrance and a passage that slowly increases in height, but then a large chamber inside. And let's go and take a look. Fortunately, the modern custodians of this site have added a light inside so that we're not plunged completely into darkness. that already you can see on the stone at the back hints of engravings. So as you progress along the entrance passageway, the ceiling gets higher. I'm now standing in the chamber with a considerable amount of space above my head. And I'm not sure if you'll be able to see it, but if we look up here on the ceiling above me, we can see some shapes carved into the stone. Now when you're able to step back and take a good look at that shape, it seems to suggest perhaps a hafted axe with a loop, perhaps to help somebody grip the handle, although there's been some debate about what it actually shows. But there are various other symbols on the rock around us, most notably these cross shapes and squares on the surface of the stone. Maybe one day we'll be able to decode what these things mean, because there's an awful lot of motifs carved inside these tombs that we find all over Brittany, and they're repeated and repeated. So they must have meant something quite important to the people who made them. Now, one of the features about the carvings, particularly the ones that are on the roof of tombs, but not exclusively, sometimes on the back of the tombs as well, is it seems that the stones they're carved on had previously been used elsewhere. And in some cases they've been shown to be the fragments of a very tall standing stone or menhir. So it would appear that the menhirs, the standing stones, had carvings on them. Then those menhirs fell, or perhaps were deliberately pushed over and destroyed, and the stones were reused, and we've been plunged into darkness, but I'm still here. The timer on the light has run out, so I think it's telling us it's time for us to leave. So let's make our way back up the passageway, and as we do so, I'm gradually having to crouch down, even lower, bump my head, and we're out. And that stone there is absolutely not accidental, nicely in line with the entrance to this tomb. And in case you missed it before, right on the top of the cairn we have another standing stone, which is possibly Bronze Age, so added perhaps 2,000 or 2,500 years after the tomb itself was built.